Hondas used to be one of the most reliable car manufacturers on the planet. Things have changed in recent years, and would you believe it? Not only has Toyota and Lexus outpaced Honda in terms of reliability, but even the likes of Mazda and even BMW is now ranked higher in terms of overall reliability as a brand than modern-day Hondas. Let's get into it now. Life's too short to drive boring cars. Older Hondas from a decade ago used to rank really high up on Consumers Reports list for overall reliability. For example, vehicles like the CR-Vs could run at least 400,000 miles. As well, beautiful vehicles like this Honda Pilot here with 470,000 kilometers is actually good for many, many years with very little maintenance, almost nothing to do but change batteries, tires, and oil. The infamous Honda Accord was also ruthlessly reliable, and Honda Civics like this would literally last you 300,000 or 400,000 miles if you took care of them and did all your standard maintenance and servicing. They were good for a lot of miles because they were simple, but there were parts that were actually very well made back in this generation, and things shifted right after this model year, and that's when things started going down the toilet. Hondas from 80s, 90s, 2000s were often a very robust little generation of cars. They kept it simple. You could get manual gearboxes in not only cars like the Honda Civics, but you could actually get them in a lot of the Honda Accords and some other models as well. Remember, manual transmissions are the simplest form of transmission and almost never fail. They also introduced the wonderful VTEC system, which changed the profile of the operating parameters within the engine, which optimized low RPM performance, and as you accelerated and brought the revs over a certain RPM, it optimized and gave you the best breathing and performance for the top end. It was a great new design, and Honda has always been known and renowned for building quality engines. After all, their Formula One program is there to justify that and confirm that. Now, one thing to know, one of the few areas that Hondas usually fail are in the engines. Their 3.5-liter V6, a little heavy on fuel, but a very reliable engine, and a lot of the other engines you'll find in a lot of the Honda Civics are very reliable. There is one exception, and we'll get to that. Let's flip the hood and find out about this. What we're looking at here is a 1.8 liter 4-cylinder engine, and it's single overhead camshaft, very simple drivetrain, and it only makes 140 horsepower, but it's extremely great on fuel and it's extremely reliable. It doesn't have all the extra technology buried in there, and particularly there's no turbochargers strapped anywhere in here. You'll notice the exhaust system on this side, there's no turbos over here to create extra power, but also extra complexity and pressure and strain in that engine. That doesn't exist. What does exist is a naturally aspirated engine that is very cheap to run, easy to maintain, and low cost for servicing. That's reliable, and that's what Honda's been known for, naturally aspirated drivetrains that put out a great amount of performance for their size and displacement. You also notice they use a lot of metal parts throughout. There's very little plastic other than the air filter housing cover and a few covers and pieces like this and shrouding. Everything in this vehicle is simple, effective, and reliable. So this is an older generation from a 2012, and that's exactly why that vehicle is as reliable as it is, because it's simple. Lots of metal, not as much plastic, and it's just good to go. No turbos, no extra heartache there. And as a result of Honda's attention to detail, the higher quality parts they were putting in these cars, they often swap punches with Toyota and Lexus for top pops in terms of overall reliability. Now things have changed a little bit. Based on Consumers Reports, in order from top to bottom, top spot goes to Toyota, then Lexus, then BMW, if you can believe it, then Mazda, and as well we talk about Honda on number 5 slot. Unfortunately, they have drastically slipped in the last few years in overall reliability based and identified by Consumers Reports. What we're looking at here is a 2012 model year of a Honda Civic. And in this generation, you could either get a manual gearbox or you can get a 5-speed automatic, which was relatively durable and matched up nicely with this performance of that output of that engine. In 2014, all of a sudden, they offered up a CVT, continuously variable trash transmission. Yes, that then became available 2 years after this 2012 model year. Everybody knows CVTs are a problem area for a lot of modern day vehicles. Right there, we're looking at an automatic transmission, as you can see. Now, unfortunately, some of the problems Honda's had recently is related to the torque converter style automatic transmission, and it's because, as what I just mentioned, the torque converter. So another huge issue that became a problem for Honda in the last decade or so had to do with That's right, it's rodents. Rodent infestation took a toll on a lot of Hondas. As a matter of fact, in 2012 to 2015, there was allegedly a lawsuit that took care of a lot of customers because their wiring was being consumed by mice. In fact, there's wiring throughout this vehicle. That's what makes a vehicle work. It takes wiring to take from the battery, feeds all your auxiliaries, your electronics, your lighting, all of that components actually takes power. And things like this wiring now was a problem because the original wiring, what most vehicles actually use is wiring that has plastic insulation on it. In other words, it's a PVC type insulation. Now Honda introduced soy-based wiring, and they're not the only ones to do that. But being a soy-based wiring, they did it for the environment, and it was a lower cost to manufacture. So a lot of these Hondas had that soy-based wiring, and that attracted rodents. And unfortunately, there's miles of that wiring throughout these vehicles. All your modules and controls that operate all the sensors within a vehicle also take that same type of wiring. So you start cutting wires because rodents are chewing on them. What do you think's going to happen? You're going to have things stop running, lights start flickering, gauges stop working. All sorts of assortment of different issues could erupt because of mice infestation in these vehicles. Big thing is you want to make sure you take a look around, peek through your engine compartment, make sure they're not making nests in tight little quarters like that. Look around throughout there in spaces that might be easy for them to hide, because that's exactly what they'll do. They'll find those little nooks and crannies, and they'll come out when nobody's looking, and they'll come and chew on your wiring. And then another problem, unfortunately, that Honda had to contend with was they introduced this beautiful little 1.4 liter turbo engine. Small displacement meant maximum fuel economy and great peppy performance. There were a lot of issues related to that engine, and over time we start to see some of these problems develop. One key piece being a lot of people didn't know what it took to maintain a turbocharged engine. In other words, you got to give it cool down time. A lot of people wouldn't do that. You could affect turbo reliability. You could take a turbo out if you let them heat up, drive them hard, park the car right away and shut the engine off. You could cook the turbo bearings. That was one issue. Of course, you need oil changes are very important with turbo engines, even more so than a regular engine. Well, it uses coolant to help cool a turbo. So there are problems and inherent maintenance related issues associated with running a turbo vehicle. A lot of people weren't aware of that, but that wasn't the issue. A lot of times turbocharged cars, they create a lot of heat, and manufacturers have to come up with other measures to mitigate detonation. In other words, you have to use a different style of spark plug. So there was maintenance criteria associated with that turbo engine that some people just didn't understand. Tucked under there, you'll have a series of spark plugs, and a spark plug basically is what ignites your air and your fuel going into that engine and creates that combustion and that pressure to turn the engine and shoot the exhaust out the backside. But those spark plugs had to be rated cold. So in other words, they resisted detonation and they responded better to the higher temps and pressures associated with a turbocharged engine. Of course, you had to think about things like that. Another issue was carbon fouling with some of the later model cars, and ignition coils were another issue that you had to contend with more frequently if you want to maintain reliability. And the big issue with that 1.5 liter turbo engine was oil and fuel dilution. In other words, when the engine was cold, you could see there was a very high probability of the rings, everything being slightly shrunken and high pressure. And if you drove the car hard when it was cold, you'd often put fuel past the rings in the engine, and that resulted in flooding the engine or putting fuel into the oil, and you dilute the oil. Well, if you put too much fuel into the oil, it starts to break down its capability to properly lubricate, and you can actually destroy an engine in enough time if you do neglect that enough. So in recent months, Honda's come up with a solution. They changed the type of oil going into it. They advise people to actually do the proper maintenance, and more importantly, don't drive the car hard when it's cold. Give it enough adequate warm-up time, and you can mitigate some of that oil dilution issues. But honestly, that was an issue, and Honda had to contend with it, unfortunately. It's so important to change your oil at least 5,000 kilometers or about 3,000 miles, regardless of using synthetic. That's my personal advice. Manufacturers are often going to allow you to extend that much further, but you can't go wrong with what you know, and that's the more frequency, the better that you do your oil services are always going to do you better. It's always going to be better for your engine and the oil dilution issues that you will see. So changing oil frequently is important. And running this cold spark plug, using a spark plug that's rated for a turbocharged engine, make sure you change these frequently too. And when you do extract a spark plug, look at that little electrode right in there. It'll often tell you what's going on in the engine. If it's oily, that's issue for sure. If it has a lot of carbon on it, that could be internal combustion issues or carboning up because of too much fuel, too rich. Or if, of course, if it's too orangey or white, it might represent running a little too lean. So definitely your spark plug is going to tell you a lot what's going on in the engine. And if you're a do-it-yourselfer, keep an eye on your spark plugs. Another big problem that's actually pushed Honda down the reliability scale has to relate it to their transmissions. As mentioned before, we're looking here at a 5-speed automatic. And these actually had a bit of an issue with them in some generations and some models that were even worse than others. For example, a lot of the Honda Accords at the turn of the century and beyond, up to a couple of years ago, where the transmissions were very problematic. In other words, they were jerky, they slipped, they resisted. In many of these Accords of many different years and of course generations, and a lot of those transmissions were problematic, whether you put the gas down and it jerks or it slips, or it just kind of gets a little juddery, or it's noisy, or there's a problem in general with its pickup. A lot of times it was related to the torque converter, and the torque converter is essentially an automatic transmission version of a clutch. That's what helps it engage and disengage, and that was problematic. And the worst part is, it's not a simple fix like changing a set of brakes at warp. It's actually could be a $3,000, $4,000, $5,000 repair when you're replacing or repairing that transmission. And there was way too many models, for example, the Honda Accords, the Odysseys, and of course some of these Honda Civics and other models did sustain some transmission issues throughout the years. So let's just put this all in perspective, everybody. Even bad pizza is still pretty good, isn't it? Well, that's the way I see Honda. And even with its fact that it's dropped a little bit in consumers' reports, it is number 5. In fact, it's ahead of a whole variety of other cars. Think of Mercedes down in number 24th slot. So in other words, other than that one problematic engine, you figure out how to mitigate some of those issues, and you've got yourself a car that will likely last for almost forever. At the end of the day, transmissions are one of the weak points of Hondas. Just understand that point. Figure out a way around that. Pick your poison, make your best selections, and move on. Honda is still a very reliable brand. They have slipped a little bit in recent years, but they're still easily one of the most reliable cars on the planet, and their relatively low cost for maintenance makes them really easy to live with. And with all of that said, you're really going to love this video. We talk about the Honda versus Toyota quality comparison. You're going to love it. Hope to see each and every one of you on the next one. We'll see you real soon. Bye-bye.